Welcome back to The Explainer. So, have you ever wondered how entire societies can passionately quote sacred texts while at the exact same time completely ignoring the passages that challenge their way of life? It's wild, right? It's this fascinating, contradictory human behavior. Today, we're unpacking a really compelling historical analysis by author Denzel Kenobi. He dives into what he calls the performative gap in American history. Basically, it's a look at how religious language was used to build societies and how specific, inconvenient texts were just systematically silenced.
All right, let's jump right into the source document. We're going to impartially examine Kenobi's essay, titled Honoring with Lips, Part 1, The Founding Silence. Kenobi takes a really rigorous, unblinking look at the historical record here. He uncovers how Scripture was explicitly leveraged by national structures to justify the status quo. And more importantly, he looks at how glaring intentional omissions were maintained over centuries to support massive economic and social institutions. It is a seriously eye-opening deep dive into the mechanics of history and theology.
To unpack this 300-year history, we're going to follow a structured path. We'll cover 1. The prophetic frame, 2. The founding silence, 3. The doctrine of discovery, 4. The antebellum argument, 5. The segregated pulpit, and finally 6. An ancient pattern.
So, starting off with Section 1, the prophetic frame, ritual voided by injustice. The author points out that long before the American Republic was even a thought, ancient prophets were already describing a very specific societal condition. In Isaiah 29, we read about people who honor the divine with their lips, but their heart is completely removed. Their reverence is just a taught precept. Similarly, Ezekiel 33 describes people who gather and hear the words, and they find them pleasant to listen to, but then they go right out and actively pursue their own unjust gain. And Kenobi makes a crucial distinction here. This isn't just generic everyday hypocrisy. It's a specific, named covenant failure. It happens when religious performance is staged directly over a life that denies the very principles that performance claims to honor.
But here is the core mechanism that really changes everything. Drawing from Amos chapter 5, Kenobi shows that in this textual framework, Yahweh doesn't just, disapprove of worship that happens alongside injustice. He rejects it completely. The presence of injustice doesn't just partially diminish a religious ritual, it entirely voids it. Take a second to think about the gravity of that. In this ancient framework, the performance doesn't just count for less, it literally doesn't count at all.
Moving right along to Section 2, the founding silence, slavery, and Scripture.
So, the American colonies in the early republic were absolutely saturated with scriptural language, and it might surprise you to see the massive lengths early pulpits and seminaries went to defend chattel slavery, using this one specific line of exegesis, the curse of Ham from Genesis 9. But as Kenobi points out, this is a massive, almost unbelievable textual leap. The curse in Genesis 9 actually fell on Canaan, not Ham broadly, and the text never once identifies Canaan's line with sub-Saharan African peoples. No way. The author argues this doctrine wasn't organically derived from Scripture. Actually, it was constructed backward from an intense economic need. Scripture was just used as convenient building material to justify an institution that was already running the economy.
And this brilliantly illustrates what Kenobi calls the founding silence. On the one hand, you've got this enormous monumental interpretive effort to stretch the curse of Ham across millennia, just to justify the transatlantic slave trade. And on the other hand, total silence regarding Exodus 21:16. This is a text located in the exact same legal corpus they were quoting, and it explicitly makes man-stealing, seizing a person to sell them into bondage, a capital offense. A legal system so eager to mine Scripture for justification was completely intentionally unable to locate a law that named their own core economic practice a capital crime. That staggering, deliberate omission, that is the founding silence.
This brings us to Section 3, Doctrine of Discovery, Conquest, and Law.
A parallel strand of history requires us to look at the doctrine of discovery. These were 15th century papal bulls authorizing Christian nations to claim lands inhabited by non-Christians. Kenobi emphasizes a vital point here. This was an institutional, European tradition with absolutely zero scriptural backing. None. There's no text in the Torah or the Gospels authorizing land theft just because the native inhabitants didn't believe. Yet, it's pretty staggering to realize that this entirely fabricated doctrine was directly cited and upheld in United States law as late as the 1823 Supreme Court case Johnson v. McIntosh. This perfectly demonstrates the prophetic warning of Isaiah 29 at the level of entire nations, invoking the name of a covenant to authorize exactly what that covenant forbids.
Fast forwarding slightly, we arrive at Section 4, the antebellum argument,
hardened doctrines.
Imagine the tension in the decades leading right up to 1861. A fierce scriptural war was being fought by both sides of the American church. Pro-slavery theologians were certainly not quiet. They had confident, booming citations, but they consistently lacked any answer to Exodus 21:16. The crucial, devastating point Kenobi makes is that this theological silence didn't resolve with more study or civilized debate. Instead, it hardened into firm, unyielding doctrine. It was preached from ordained pulpits all across the country and carried straight onto the battlefields by soldiers fighting and dying to preserve a practice that the scripture they claimed to revere explicitly condemned.
As we look at the timeline, history moves seamlessly from the end of slavery into the rise of segregation. The Civil War ends in 1865, emancipation occurs, but then the Jim Crow era almost immediately takes its place. The author's analysis shows us something chilling here. While the legal status of individuals changed on paper, the underlying theology driving the society didn't change one bit. Which brings us to our final historical case study in Section 5, the segregated pulpit, repurposing the curse. So the curse of Ham didn't just vanish with emancipation. It was remarkably and tragically repurposed. Think about that for a second. Kenobi argues that the exact same exegetical claim used to violently defend slavery was just smoothed out and redeployed to provide the theological substructure for separate but equal. A divinely ordained racial hierarchy didn't strictly require legal ownership to function. It just needed a subordinate place for the supposedly cursed line. And Jim Crow gladly supplied that subordinate place. In schools, railcars, and yes, even churches.
And this brings us to another glaring theological contradiction. A rigid racial hierarchy was preached Sunday after Sunday to maintain societal segregation. Meanwhile, texts like Galatians 3:28, which famously states that in the body of the Messiah there is neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, were intentionally left unpreached, just ignored. A plain, honest reading of Galatians completely flattens the exact racial hierarchy the segregated church was built to preserve. This, Kenobi points out, is that Amos 5 mechanism operating in real time. Active worship coexisting with engineered societal injustice, which effectively voids the ritual entirely.
Looking at the broad sweep of this history, the source connects this back in Section 6, an ancient pattern, the performative gap. To show just how deep this really goes, Kenobi cites the Wisdom of Solomon. This ancient text describes the wicked actively plotting against the righteous. Why? Precisely because the righteous person's very manner of life is a direct reproach and accusation against their own conduct. This tells us something profound. The American performative gap isn't just some modern anomaly. The phenomenon of people calling themselves children of the Lord while vigorously opposing everything that relationship requires, that's a documented historical pattern. It's literally one of the oldest human failures in the historical record, merely recurring century after century under a brand new flag. When you take a step back, the ultimate takeaway of this entire historical document is a massive, deliberate asymmetry. On one side, you have incredible interpretive labor mobilized by scholars, lawmakers, and pulpits to bend and twist texts like Genesis 9 just to justify a brutal economic institution. And on the other side, conspicuous absence. A total, deafening silence regarding explicit scriptures like Exodus 21:16 that required absolutely no interpretive labor whatsoever to condemn the practice outright. That deliberate structural asymmetry is the true definition of the founding silence.
By understanding this historical blueprint, we're forced to ask a really difficult, deeply relevant question as we look toward part 2 of the author's work. Where does this performative structure, invoking a sacred covenant to authorize exactly what it forbids, where does that persist in the vocabulary and controversies of our present hour? It's a compelling thought to sit with, and one that absolutely reframes how we look at both history and our modern world. Thanks for joining me on this explainer. Keep questioning, and I'll see you next time.